May 15th, 1997. Mount Vernon, New York. A quiet, leafy suburb just north of New York City, the kind of place where neighbors discuss lawn care, property taxes, and Little League scores. In a modest two-story house, a man named Jack Barsky was living the quintessential American life. He was 47 years old, a systems analyst for a major power utility, a loving husband, and a doting father to a young daughter, Chelsea. He barbecued on weekends, he complained about the commute, he paid his mortgage. To the outside world, he was utterly unremarkable, a face in the crowd, a cog in the great American middle-class machine. But as Jack drove his car toward the Delaware Water Gap that afternoon, watching the Pennsylvania tree line blur past his window, his heart rate was synchronized with a terror no suburban dad should ever know. He wasn't Jack Barsky. The real Jack Barsky had died in 1955 at the age of 10. The man driving the car was Albrecht Dittrich, a specially trained agent of the Soviet KGB, born in East Germany, sent across the Atlantic 2 decades earlier with a singular mission: to burrow deep into the belly of the capitalist beast and wait. For 20 years, he had lived a lie so complete that he had almost forgotten the truth himself. He had deceived the FBI, the NSA, and his employers back in Moscow. But the cruelest deception wasn't against the government, it was against the woman waiting for him at home. His wife believed she had married an awkward, intelligent man with a difficult past. She had no idea that the man sleeping beside her was a lieutenant in the KGB's elite Directorate S, the illegals program. She had no idea that beneath the mundane clutter of their basement, hidden among old tax returns and holiday decorations, lay the tools of international espionage. What she was about to discover would not just end a marriage, it would shatter the very concept of reality she had lived in for a decade. This is the story of how the Cold War didn't end with the fall of a wall in Berlin, but in a basement in New York, where a family realized that their entire history was a fabrication of the Soviet state. To understand how a communist spy becomes a capitalist dad, we must rewind the clock to a world of gray concrete and red flags. Jena, East Germany, 1970. Albrecht Dittrich was a brilliant young chemist at the university, a true believer in the socialist cause. He was the new Soviet man, intelligent, athletic, and ideologically pure. He didn't see the Berlin Wall as a prison. He saw it as an anti-fascist protection rampart. When a man in a trench coat approached him with an offer to serve the motherland in a special capacity, Albrecht didn't hesitate. He was told he could be the tip of the spear. The KGB sent him to a secret training facility in Berlin. For years, he was systematically stripped of his identity. He learned Morse code, cryptography, surveillance detection, and microfilm photography. But the hardest training wasn't technical, it was cultural. He had to learn to walk like an American, eat like an American, and think like an American. He spent hours watching Hollywood movies, not for entertainment, but to study how men held their cigarettes, how they crossed their legs, how they laughed. He memorized the starting lineups of Major League Baseball teams from 1975. He learned that Americans smiled with their teeth, something reserved and rare in East Germany. In 1978, Albrecht Dittrich ceased to exist. He traveled to Moscow, then Belgrade, then Rome, Vienna, and finally Mexico City. From there, he walked across the border into the United States using a fake passport. His instructions were simple yet terrifying. Go to a specific graveyard in Maryland. Find the tombstone of a boy who died young. Request the birth certificate. Become him. He chose Jack Barsky, a boy who had died in 1955. With that birth certificate, he got a library card. With the library card, a driver's license. With the license, a social security number. The bureaucracy of the United States, designed for honest citizens, was easily weaponized by the methodical patience of the KGB. Jack Barsky arrived in New York City with $6,000 in cash and a mission to infiltrate the highest levels of American political and scientific circles. But the America he found was not the rotting, dystopian nightmare depicted in Soviet propaganda. It was 1978. The grocery stores were cathedrals of abundance. Decades later, Jack would recall his first visit to a generic American supermarket. He stood in the produce aisle, paralyzed. In East Germany, getting an orange was a once-a-year event, a Christmas miracle. Here, there were mountains of oranges, pyramids of apples, endless rows of vegetables, and no guards. No lines, no ration cards. He thought it must be a Potemkin village, a fake display setup to fool him. But then he watched a woman in curlers casually toss a bag of oranges into her cart without even looking at the price. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. If the Soviet system was superior, why did the enemy have so much food? Despite the shock, Jack remained a loyal soldier. By day, he worked as a bicycle messenger, risking his life in Manhattan traffic to blend in. By night, he was a spy. His apartment was a fortress of secrets. Every Thursday at 9:15 p.m., he would tune his shortwave radio to a specific frequency. Through the static, a voice from a transmitter in Cuba or Russia would read a string of numbers, 49215, 33802. To anyone else, it was random noise. To Jack, armed with a one-time pad, a tiny booklet of encryption keys that could be read only once and then destroyed, it was orders from the center: go to the drop site in Queens, leave the canister, signal the contact. He spent years climbing the social ladder. He put himself through college, graduating as valedictorian from Baruch College, eventually landing a job at Metropolitan Life Insurance and later at a power grid company. He was the perfect sleeper agent, embedded in infrastructure, highly educated, completely unsuspected. But the KGB had made a miscalculation. They had accounted for the FBI, they had accounted for the CIA, they had not accounted for the corrosive power of the American dream and the human heart. Jack met a woman. Let's call her Penelope, though her name changes in various accounts to protect her privacy. She was an immigrant from Guyana, hardworking, kind, and looking for stability. Jack, the trained manipulator, initially saw her as part of his cover. A wife made him look normal. A wife anchored his legend. But a strange thing happened during the charade. He actually fell in love. They married, they moved to the suburbs, they had a daughter, Chelsea, and suddenly the legend became the reality. Albrecht Dittrich, the communist ideologue, was dying. Jack Barsky, the dad who worried about his daughter's fever and his 401, was taking over. The crisis point came in 1988. The KGB, sensing that their agent was going native, or perhaps fearing he was compromised, sent a terrifying signal. It was a specific code on the radiogram that meant emergency. Return home immediately, do not say goodbye, just go. Jack stood in his kitchen, the decrypted message in his hand. He looked at his infant daughter playing on the floor. He knew what return home meant. It meant interrogation. It meant never seeing his child again. It meant a gray life in a collapsing empire. He did the unthinkable. He ignored the order. The KGB persisted. A fellow agent tracked him down in a subway station in New York, a terrifying breach of protocol. The agent, a man Jack knew only by a code name, whispered a threat: "You must come back, or else." Jack Barsky, the man who had been trained to kill, made a calculation. He knew the Soviet system was bureaucratic and currently chaotic as Gorbachev tried to salvage the economy. He decided to bluff. He sent a message back to the center. "I have contracted HIV/AIDS. I am dying. I cannot return. I will stay here and die in the US to protect the network security." It was a brilliant lie. In 1988, AIDS was a death sentence and a terrifying stigma. The KGB, terrified of the disease and pragmatic about their assets, bought it. They cut him loose. They told him to lay low and die quietly. A portion of his death benefit was even paid out to his family back in East Germany. For the next 9 years, Jack Barsky lived as a ghost. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Berlin Wall fell. The entity he served ceased to exist. He was a spy without a country, a man with no past, living in a suburban house with a wife and child who didn't know his real name. He thought he had escaped. He thought he had won. But secrets are like radioactive waste. They have a half-life, and they eventually leak. The KGB archives were opening up. A defector from the Russian intelligence services, Vasily Mitrokhin, had smuggled thousands of files out of Russia in his shoes and jacket lining. Among those files was the name Albrecht Dittrich and his alias, Jack Barsky. The FBI began watching. They bugged his house. They bugged his car. They bought the house next door and moved agents in. They watched him mow the lawn. They watched him teach his daughter to ride a bike. They couldn't believe this boring, balding IT professional was a top-tier Soviet illegal. On that fateful day in May 1997, as Jack drove home, his car was pulled over. He wasn't tackled by a SWAT team. A man in a suit simply walked up to his window and showed a badge. It was Joe Riley, an FBI counterintelligence agent. Riley didn't scream. He simply said, "We know who you are, Albrecht." Jack Barsky froze. The sound of his birth name, spoken in an American accent on a Pennsylvania highway, sounded like a gunshot. He looked at the agent, he looked at the traffic, and he exhaled. A 20-year breath. "What took you so long?" Jack asked. The interrogation that followed was not one of torture, but of negotiation. Jack Barsky had a choice: spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison or cooperate. He chose to cooperate. He told them everything: codes, dead drops, training methods, the psychology of the illegal. He became one of the most valuable intelligence assets the US ever acquired, not for current intel, but for understanding the methodology of the enemy. But the hardest interrogation wasn't with the FBI, it was yet to come. Agent Riley told him, "Jack, you have to tell your wife. If you don't, we will. And trust me, you want to be the one to do it." This brings us to the basement. The prompt asks what his wife found. In the literal sense, the FBI had already stripped the house of the high-tech gear during their clandestine searches. But the reveal to the wife was a moment of psychological horror that centered on the hidden spaces of their home, the physical manifestation of his lies. Jack returned home, accompanied by FBI agents who waited outside. He walked into the living room. Penelope was there. She looked at his face, pale and aged by a decade in a single afternoon, and asked what was wrong. "I am not the man you think I am," he began. He led her to his study area, the basement workspace where he had spent countless nights working late. For years, she had respected this space as the domain of a hard-working provider. Now, he began to point things out. Not just papers, but the invisible architecture of his betrayal. He pulled out the old shortwave radio. To her, it had been a hobbyist's toy. Now, he explained its true purpose. It was his umbilical cord to Moscow. He showed her the innocent-looking books on the shelf. He explained how they contained cipher patterns. He showed her his passport, the document she had signed tax returns with, the name she had taken in marriage. "This name," he said, pointing to Jack Barsky, "belongs to a dead boy. I stole it from a graveyard in Maryland." The psychological violence of this moment is hard to overstate. Imagine looking at your spouse, the parent of your child, and realizing that their accent, their history, their childhood stories, their very name were all a script written by a committee in a foreign capital. She looked at the basement of his life, the foundation their marriage was built on, and saw that it was a hollow stage set. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Who have I been sleeping with?" "I am Albrecht Dittrich," he said. "I am a German. I have a family in Germany. I have a wife there. I have a son there." This was the second blow, the one that broke the camel's back. Not only was he a spy, but he was also a bigamist. He had left a life behind in East Germany, a life that the KGB had promised to maintain for him. The contents of the basement, the radio, the pads, the secret compartments were not just spy gear. They were evidence that every moment of intimacy, every shared dinner, every "I love you" had been performed under the shadow of treason. He had been listening to orders to destroy the very country she lived in while she made him coffee upstairs. The revelation broke Penelope. She kicked him out. The marriage ended. The lie was too big to forgive. But the story didn't end in tragedy for Jack. The FBI, realizing that Jack was no longer a threat and had fully defected in his heart years prior by refusing the order to return, allowed him to stay in the United States. He wasn't deported. He wasn't imprisoned. In a twist of irony that only America could produce, the former KGB spy was allowed to keep his stolen name. He remained Jack Barsky. He eventually remarried. He became a U.S. citizen in 2014. The judge who swore him in held his hand and welcomed him home, the final victory of the American system over the Soviet one. The Soviets tried to force loyalty through fear and walls. The Americans secured it through forgiveness and freedom. However, the haunting image remains. A wife standing in the quiet of her own home, looking at the familiar objects of her husband's life, the radio, the desk, the papers, and realizing that they were instruments of war. The story of Jack Barsky is a testament to the fact that the Cold War wasn't just fought with ICBMs and tank divisions. It was fought in the suburbs. It was fought in the gap between a husband and a wife. It was fought in the silence of a basement, where a man sat by a glowing radio dial, listening to a voice from 5,000 miles away, trying to decide whether he was a soldier of the revolution or a father to the little girl sleeping upstairs. In the end, the father won. But the cost was the truth. To understand the sheer magnitude of the deception, we have to look at the mechanics of the illegal program. The KGB didn't just send spies. They sent actors who never broke character. This was the pinnacle of Soviet intelligence tradecraft known as legend building. When Jack Barsky arrived in the US, his first task was to shed his German skin. He forced himself to talk to strangers, noting their reactions. If someone looked confused, he analyzed his pronunciation. He realized he was too stiff, too polite. Americans were loose, loud, casual. He practiced slouching. He practiced interrupting people. He practiced the subtle arrogance of a man who has never had to show his papers to a checkpoint guard. The basement, or his sanctuary, was where the two halves of his brain met. During the day, at his job as a systems analyst, he was fully American. He argued about sports, he complained about taxes, but at night, the discipline of the Directorate S kicked in. The dead drop was a crucial part of his life that he hid from his family. A dead drop is a location used to pass items between two people without them ever meeting. Jack's drops were often mundane locations: a rusted pipe in a park in Queens, a loose brick behind a library in Yonkers, a hollow tree near a hiking trail. He would spend hours preparing a package. This might be a canister of film containing photographs of sensitive documents, or a report on his assessment of American political stability. He would wrap it in waterproof material, often disguised as a dirty soda can or a rock. On the designated night, he would tell his wife he was going for a long drive to clear his head, or that he had a late shift. He would drive for hours, checking for surveillance, making 3 right turns, speeding up, slowing down, stopping suddenly. This is called a dry cleaning run. Only when he was 100% sure he wasn't being followed would he approach the drop site. He would leave the package. Then he had to signal that the drop was made. This usually involved making a chalk mark on a specific telephone pole or mailbox miles away. A vertical line meant package delivered. A horizontal line meant abort, danger. For 20 years, Jack Barsky lived this adrenaline-fueled duality. And for 20 years, his wife saw only a man who sometimes seemed stressed, sometimes distant, but always came home. The discovery of the truth forced a reevaluation of every memory. The times he was moody, was he worried about a sick relative? Or was he terrified that the FBI had found a microdot in his trash? The times he was excited, was it because of a promotion or because the center had praised his latest report? The most chilling artifact found in the basement of lies was the realization of what his mission actually was. Jack wasn't James Bond. He wasn't stealing nuclear codes. His mission was far more insidious. He was a sleeper. His job was to be ready. In the event of a World War III, sleeper agents like Jack were to be activated to sabotage American infrastructure, power grids, water supplies, communication networks. The man who paid the electric bill for his family was trained to shut off the electricity for the entire eastern seaboard. The man who drank tap water in his kitchen knew how to poison the reservoir. This is what changed his wife's life. It wasn't just the betrayal of infidelity or identity, it was the realization that she had been sleeping next to a weapon. Yet, the story has a redemption arc that resonates with the American spirit. Jack Barsky eventually wrote a book, Deep Undercover. He speaks to audiences about the dangers of ideology. He reconciled with the God he had been taught to despise by the atheistic Soviet state. When the FBI finally caught him, the agent, Joe Riley, became one of Jack's closest friends. They would play golf together on weekends. The hunter and the hunted, walking the fairways of a country that one swore to protect and the other swore to destroy. At his baptism, years after his discovery, Jack said, "I was a man of 2 faces. I lived in the dark. But the light of this country, the light of my family, was stronger than the darkness of my training." But the scars remain. His first family in Germany grew up without a father, told he was on a secret mission, only to find out decades later he had started a new life. His American family had to rebuild their sense of self from the ground up. The basement represents the subconscious of the Cold War. On the surface, everything seemed fine. The 1,980 seconds were booming, malls were full, TV was in color. But underneath, in the basements of ordinary houses, the gears of a secret war were turning. Jack Barsky's story is a reminder that history isn't just written in treaties and battlefields. It is written in the secrets we keep from the ones we love. It forces us to ask, how well do you really know the person across the dinner table? When the wife went down to that basement, metaphorically speaking, she didn't just find a radio. She found the 20th century. She found the ideological struggle that had divided the planet. And she found it plugged into a wall socket, humming quietly, right next to the washing machine. In the end, the Soviet Union fell not just because of economics or politics, but because its agents, its very best men, came to America and discovered that life was simply better here. Jack Barsky was supposed to destroy the American dream. Instead, he was seduced by it. He was conquered by the simple, undeniable power of a suburban life, a full refrigerator, and the freedom to be whoever you want to be, even if who you want to be is a dad named Jack. Today, if you met Jack Barsky, you would see an older gentleman with a sharp mind and a slight accent that he can't quite hide. You might talk to him about the weather, you might ask him about his golf game, but if you look closely at his eyes, you can still see the shadow of Albrecht Dittrich, the boy from Jena who was sent to burn down the world, and instead decided to grill burgers in the backyard. The basement is empty now. The radio is in a museum. The codes are declassified. But the lesson remains. The strongest fortress in the world isn't the Kremlin or the Pentagon. It's the family home. And the most powerful weapon isn't a nuclear missile. It's the truth. And eventually, inevitably, the truth comes out of the basement. The legacy of Jack Barsky serves as a final human footnote to the Cold War. It proves that while ideologies can create soldiers, only love can create men. And in the silent war between the state and the soul usually, eventually, wins. But as his wife learned that day in 1997, the victory often comes with a terrible price. She lost her husband so that he could finally find himself. And that is the true ending of the story. Not an explosion, not a car chase, but a quiet conversation in a living room, where a mask falls off and 2 people look at each other across the ruins of a lie, realizing that the war is over, but the cleanup has just begun. The irony of The Spy Who Loved Me is that he did love her. He just wasn't the me she thought he was. And in the complex calculus of the human heart, that is the one code that can never fully be cracked.